All right, here we go. Now we're going to start getting into our content. So I'm going to be covering chapter 1 in this lecture today, introducing like what is sociology. Hopefully, I mean, you can do this in the order that you want, the order that you feel comfortable, but hopefully you've done your chapter 1 quiz. That's what I personally would recommend for like the sequence of things. Do the quiz before watching the lecture video, just because I want to make sure you're opening up your textbook. You know, that book was designed to be accessible. I love the textbook, not only because he's my mentor and department chair, but just the accessibility of it. A lot of the times in academia or in college, whatever you want to call it, they write these really high level textbooks using language that's like, you know, made for people who have been given like great access to education. And this book really just is real, right? It's very much like, say it for what it is. Like, we don't need to add huge academic jargon to understand what sociology is. So sociology in definition is just the study of social behavior. So in sociology, we look at relationships, social structures. When you hear us say social structures, we're talking about, you know, anything almost. Like education is a structure, the way your schools are structured. We look at how we interact with one another. And especially right now, looking at social problems and inequality. You know, we're going to be talking a lot about what's going on in the world, about what's going on in the United States. Just a few weeks ago, January 6th, there was what they're calling an insurrection at the Capitol, you know, where we had white supremacists rushing our capital, our nation's capital in Washington, D.C., because they didn't agree with these election results. And so, you know, hopefully you're staying up to date, whether that be through social media. Like, I do not downplay social media as a source of news, but definitely make sure you're checking your sources. Like, don't, you know, if you're on a website that's like conservativesonly.com, you know, obviously the content that you get is going to be very conservative leaning. If you're on one that says liberalsunite.org, you know, the content you're going to get is very much biased. And so make sure that when you are using social media platforms or going out to see the news and what's going on, that you understand, you know, that there may be some bias, you know, happening in the way the news is reported. And we'll continue to talk about media outlets, news outlets, and things like that, and how they can really, although they're designed to kind of be this very like neutral, you know, reporting of the news, as people say, they're very much not. You know, they're very much not neutral. And so sociology, again, is just study of social behavior. And one of the main things that one of the main concepts, I had to pause, y'all. I don't know if you could hear it on your end, but my dog was doing something very weird in the background. And so one of the biggest, you know, concepts or like foundational concepts in sociology is this term called the sociological imagination. And that was coined by a sociologist named C. Wright Mills in 1959. And basically, you'll come across a lot of different definitions of the sociological imagination. And that's something that's very common in not only in sociology, but in all disciplines. But the one that I'm going to use for this class is the awareness of who we are as individuals and the social forces that shape our lives. Okay. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and just use a PowerPoint to get through this. I feel like maybe there may be some visual learners, and so I want to acknowledge and honor our visual learners in this. So the awareness of who we are as individuals and the social forces that shape our lives. It's understanding that I Shantae Mitchum, you know, Black woman in California, San Diego, you know, if you want to narrow it down, Vista, my experiences are not only individual experiences, but they may be connected to larger social forces. It may be, you know, when we're talking about Black women in general, you can put 20 Black women in the room, and the chances of you coming across, you know, very common threads, very common experiences is very high. You can take a Black woman from, you know, upper middle class, meaning growing up very privileged, you know, maybe they grew up on the East Coast, and put them in a room with Black women who grew up in lower class and on the West Coast, right? And you will still be able to find commonalities. And so your individual experiences are connected. And we call those like private troubles versus public issues. Private troubles are the things that maybe if I am homeless, right? If I'm viewing this as a private trouble, I would say, okay, well, I'm homeless because I can't find a job. I can't find a job. Maybe, a lot of people will kind of connect that to laziness, right? So you might hear, oh, well, people are homeless because they're lazy. They don't want to go out and get a job, right? That's a very simplistic way of viewing this larger social issue of homelessness. Now, to connect that, what a sociologist does in talking about homelessness or any, social issue or inequality we have in our society is we connect that to a public issue. So we don't say people are homeless because they're lazy. Maybe are there the few, right? This is not to say all cases. Potentially, right? Potentially they don't want to get a job, but overwhelmingly we look at the structures. So why is it difficult for people who are homeless to get jobs? How is the job field, the job market structured in a way that really kind of privileges people from certain backgrounds? And so if you grew up homeless, right? If that was your life growing up homeless, have you been given the same opportunities as someone who grew up in a household where both parents worked, right? And they were taught interviewing skills. They were taught how to groom themselves, what to wear, how to behave in a job interview. Another thing that's connected to homelessness is felony records, right? So a lot of people who have felony records, and we're going to debunk this myth of, felony as something being bad, right? We're definitely going to talk about that a lot in this class. One of my kind of like likings and what I'm really drawn to in sociology is mass incarceration, right? And so when we're looking at felony records, we have been taught to view them as very bad. And that's not to say that there are not some people who commit felonies who quote deserve to be in prison, right? I'm not making that argument. But the way that felonies are structured in our society, right? We have a lot of people in prison now for felony records for low-level drug offenses, right? And you get out, your felony travels with you everywhere you go, right? So when you're filling out a job application, you have to check this box, and there's a lot of push towards getting rid of this stigma around people with felonies, right? Like, why is it that after I've served my time, I then have to check a box that prevents me from getting housing, that prevents me from getting certain jobs, financial aid? There's a lot of things that you are no longer qualified for having a felony record. And so sociology doesn't just look at, okay, you're homeless because you're lazy, right? It looks at, okay, there's a large amount of people, especially in San Diego, LA, et cetera, in very particular areas who struggle with homelessness. And so why is that, right? Why is that this is such a large social issue? It's not a private trouble. It's a public issue. It's an issue of employment. It's an issue of housing availability, an issue of the way that homeless shelters are structured or underfunded, right? So sociology does not look at the personal issue, and that doesn't mean that people don't have their decision, like, because an argument is like, well, they choose X, Y, and Z, right? It's their choice, okay? And to understand that through a sociological perspective is like, yes, everyone does have a decision, a choice to make, or what we call agency, the right to choose. But my choices, so let's say I have, I'm a upper middle class white man choosing to go out looking for employment. My options, my A through D options are going to look very different. So yes, I have the choice A through D, and I'm thinking of this on like multiple choice quizzes, right? You have A through D. Those are your options. They're going to look very different than a lower class Black man who is going out looking for employment, but his A through D, his options are not the same, right? His social structures, his experiences, his life, the way that his life has been set up through various systems is very different. So yes, they both can choose A through D, but their options are very different depending on their background. And so that is very important to understand when you're talking about any social issue. It's not saying that people don't have agency, people don't choose particular things. The biggest one I hear is like when people commit a crime. Well, you chose to steal that car. That was your choice, right? Sociology is understanding, well, why did this person, a poor single mother, go out and commit this crime, right? Why did she go out and quote, steal a car or steal from a grocery store? She committed a crime, but maybe she was trying to feed her family. Maybe she was on her, getting ready to get let go from work. And if she missed one more day of work, she's fired, right? And now her whole life, her decisions are gonna look very different than someone who grew up with a family who provided them means of transportation, who you could call your mom and say, hey, I need $20 for dinner tonight, right? People's choices are very different depending on these social structures. And so we can go through that all day, talking about homelessness, incarceration, crime, education, like why someone chooses to go to community college versus a university. Like you can do this all day with sociology. And so also in this chapter, we talk about, these are going to be our main theories. So there's 3 main theories that we operate off on a 101 level. And that's our functionalism, conflict, and symbolic interactionist. And I really want you to think about the word, like functionalism views society as a system of interrelated parts where any element that endures over time is interpreted as fundamental and necessary. Basically, if it's been a part of our society, it works. It's supposed to be there. It serves a function and it's necessary, right? And so this can be a little problematic, right? Because let's talk about, poverty. Poverty has persisted over time. So if you're viewing things from a functionalist perspective, we would say that poverty serves a function in our society. And that sounds really odd to say, right? But we're going to break that down sociologically. We have our manifest and latent functions. I don't really need you to get caught up on understanding like which is a manifest, which is a latent. Like I'm going to break that down and to say what are the intended and unintended consequences of a system. So when we're talking about education, for instance, what is the intended consequence of education? So education has functioned in our society. It's been a system, for hundreds of years, over 400 years, the system has existed. So it's functional, right? So the manifest or the intended consequence of education is to be that we are teaching people how to be better citizens in society. That once you go through our K through 12 system, once you go through this community college system or this 4-year university, private, whatever system you go through, that you are now going to be a functioning person in society. And I'm going to specifically talk about K through 12, not only because, most of you in this class, or actually all of you who are taking my class at this current moment, are in your, in high school. So either you're freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, whatever element whatever part you're on. But we've all, for the most part, endured a K through 12 system. And so I feel like that is very relatable in talking about manifest and latent functions. So the manifest or the intended consequences of our K through 12 system is, again, it's teaching you how to be a person, teaching you how to listen, how to, become like transmitting dominant culture. So like learning how to be a team player, learning how to have school spirit, right? Like mascots serve a purpose, right? Those are all the intended consequences or the manifest functions of education. The latent or the unintended consequences are often the ones that people don't talk about. But as a sociologist, that's what we focus on. It's like this system was designed to create better people, right? To teach youth how to be, functioning members of our society. But what happens when we look at, for instance, like, a high school in a low-income neighborhood versus a high school in a affluent or rich neighborhood, right? And we can even throw in race in there. A high school that is very much people of color, like Oceanside Unified. I know this because I went there, right, y'all? Okay. Oceanside Unified is what we call like a majority minority school. There's a lot of brown and black folk there. There's a lot of Pacific Islander people. There's a lot of non-white communities of color. Okay, so if you compare a district like Oceanside Unified to a district like Carlsbad, and I know y'all know, I know you know that there is a very big difference in those two districts. There's a difference in access. There's a difference in the availability of classes or the types of classes that you're offered. There's a difference in all of that relates to, you know, how the schools are funded. So public schools are funded off of property taxes. So let's think about, you know, look around Oceanside Unified, okay? Whether that be El Camino, Ocean Shore, or Ditmar, it used to be Ocean Shores, whatever the name of the school is now, the continuation school, and Oceanside High School. The property taxes, so meaning the houses, the value of the houses in those neighborhoods are very much lower than the value of the houses in Carlsbad. And so the schools, because schools are funded off property taxes, the schools are funded differently. Okay, so that is the reason why schools in rich or affluent neighborhoods look different. And Oceanside, y'all have a beautiful campus. Okay, there's beautiful campus right by the beach, and I'm not undermining the school in any way, because this is across. You can take any school and compare it to a school, you know, whether that be in San Diego Unified. Okay, you go all the way to San Alejo Hills and look at those houses. Those high schools are funded better than even the ones in Carlsbad. So this is all relational and looking at, you know, how that relates to the quality of education that you get, right? Like, as much as we do not like to say things like this as educators, but their teachers don't always want to teach in low-income schools. There's assumptions about students in low-income schools. There's assumptions of criminality about students in low-income schools. And so what happens, right? And I can say that, you know, as an alumni of Oceanside Unified, I had some amazing teachers. Okay, I had some great, amazing teachers who are still there, right? And so that was, you know, that was great for me to see that, but overwhelmingly, like systematically on a systematic level, so meaning that not just looking at Oceanside, but overwhelmingly, teachers don't always gravitate towards schools in low-income communities of color. That's not a common practice. And there's reasons for that, right? But that is an unintended consequence of education. And so, you know, we can even look at our prison system. We can use these type of examples to look at various systems in our society: education, prison, employment, healthcare, right? We can go on and on and on. But basically, functionalism looks at how has this functioned over time? What are the intended and unintended consequences of this system in particular? And so some examples of theorists, and I'm always going to put a disclaimer on this because in academia in general, we have very much as a system highlighted and elevated the work of rich white folks. And that's the best way I can say it. And that's problematic in many levels because there's this assumption that, you know, Black people, Chicana, Latina people, you know, people from diverse backgrounds were not producing knowledge. All of our knowledge that we learn in K through 12s comes from a very Eurocentric or white perspective. That's what we're going to get right here. Okay, that's very much, you know, what we're going to be presented at a lot of a Social 101 level. But just know, like, there were people of color very early on doing sociology. Many of us lived sociology, okay, without having the language that was placed on it on an academic level. So you have Auguste Comte and positivism. So Auguste Comte came up with this idea that there's only one truth to be discovered through science. You can't use religion, you can't use experience, you can't use any other form of understanding to get at the truth, right? And I reiterate that this came from a very white male perspective because your truth, you know, what you experience as somebody who came from a privileged background is going to look very different than someone else's truth who has experienced racism, injustice, all of these things, right? Like, And so this idea that you can only discover truth through science is problematic, because what has science been used for in the past? Science has been used to try and prove that Black people are inferior, that the eugenics movement is one of the most notorious movements for they call scientific racism. And so they use science. Science was used, right? And they tried to prove this truth that Black people were inferior because they investigated what our skulls looked like. They did all of these things, right? And they try to prove through science to justify enslaving Black people. And so when you have this idea of there's only one truth to be discovered, I have problems with that. Because science has not always been used, actually in a lot of cases, it has been used to justify racism, to justify genocide, to justify sterilization of women of color so that they cannot produce children, right? It has been used for white supremacist ideologies over time. And so this concept is problematic, but again, it is a sociological concept. And so just because I'm presenting it, I'm always going to present, if I have problems with it, if there's a piece of that missing, because for a long time, people really believe this, right? Like, how do you believe in this idea that people are inferior based off of their genetic makeup, based off of the amount of melanin they have in their skin, right? Like, they really tried to use that, and that was through science. They use science to try and prove this truth, right? And then we have this guy, Emil Durkheim, and this concept of anomie. So Emil Durkheim did this study about, he looked at Protestants and Catholics and their suicide rates. And so ultimately what he was trying to say is that societies that function off of very high control, very, very structured, like Catholics, right? So Catholic, in comparison to a Protestant religion, Catholic religion is very much more structured, very much more high control. Like, there are very particular things that you have to do before you can be baptized. There are very particular things. There's a very specific way that you pray. There's a very specific way that you bless yourself. There's a bit, like, it's very specific, and they call that a very high control, right? So he was trying to prove that, like, high control societies, or in this case, religion, are more functional than lower controlled, okay? And so what he related that to is suicide rates. So people who live in a very high controlled environment, where they have a lot more rules, are less likely to commit suicide than people who are in very low controlled environments. And so you can think of this, even to take the religion aspect out of it, you could think of it as one parent versus two parent households, right? A one parent household is going to be very much less structured in comparison to a two parent household. And that has nothing to do with parenting styles, right? That's just the reality of, you have one parent who's possibly working, right? And so their ability to kind of always be present, always be in the business is less possible, or less, they're not able to be as involved as two parent households, where maybe you have a stay-at-home mom or only one working parent, right? Which nowadays both parents are working, because the way our economy is set up, one income is just not enough anymore. And so ultimately, it looked at this high control versus low control environment, and how that ability to function in our society. And so the next theory, which happens to be one of my favorites, because just the work that I do, is our conflict theory. So conflict theory focuses on how the imbalance of power in social relationships leads to the uneven distribution of resources. So this is our race, class, and gender theories, and those are all separate. And so it's really looking at on the levels of race, for instance, like who has, when you're looking at a racial hierarchy, because we have one, we absolutely have one. Data proves that we have one. Look at who's in power. Look at who represents our Congress, who represents, our people who make decisions for our government, right? It's very much white, very much, for the most part, male. when you're looking at gender, very much for the most part upper class when you're looking at class, and how having like there's inequality within each of those areas, right? Inequality, and there's consequences for people who do not fall in those positions of power. And so the first one we're going to go over is our race theory. So W.E.B. Du Bois he was a Black man. He was the first American sociologist. Okay, so a lot of the sociologists came from Europe, and he was one of the first American sociologists as a Black man. And this, I'm gonna just underscore the fact that in academia, we like to highlight white men as the producers of knowledge. There are some sociology textbooks who don't even mention Du Bois, as in he was one of the first. He was the first American sociologist to publish and do work in sociology as a Black man. And some textbooks don't even highlight his work. So that just goes to say, you know, how we value whiteness, we value maleness, specifically white male, as producers of knowledge, as producers of textbooks. And so Du Bois came up with this term called double consciousness. And double consciousness is the idea that Black people in the United States maintain a dueling identity, simultaneously American and Black, thus experiencing social marginality. So basically, he was trying to say, like, for example, we have a really good example of this right now, is there is a highlight or spotlight on policing in the United States right now, right? Policing or this Blue Lives Matter is in opposition to Black Lives Matter, right? Period. Like, there is no other way to say the two. Blue Lives Matter came out of this, Black Lives Matter came out of this idea of stop killing us, right? Stop killing us, stop shooting us, period. We're being shot on very disproportionate rates in comparison to other races, and that's something we will continue to talk about in this class. We cannot ignore what's going on in the world in sociology, as uncomfortable as it may be for some people. But I say that to say double consciousness happens when, let's say you have a Black police officer, right? What do you do when you have, because these two identities in the United States have been set up as opposition, period, end of sentence. Black, and that was pitted, they were pitted against one another. Whether that was the intention or not, that is the outcome of the Black Lives Matter movement and of this claim for Blue Lives Matter. Regardless of what side you find yourself on, the two have been viewed as opposition, right? Blue Lives Matter is very much representing this idea of like, we are American, like we are protecting the United States. Black Lives Matter is like, well, protect us, right? Like protect us. And so when you have Black police officers, they are experiencing this idea of double consciousness. How am I going to protect and serve as a Black man or as a Black woman who understands that my Blackness is always going to be my main identity, right? When I take off a uniform, I become, or I am still Black. I am still a part of this community who is screaming like Black Lives Matter, right? And so it's this idea that you know, and this also too could be related to Latinx communities, right? Undocumented communities where you are in the United States, and yet not viewed as someone who's American, not viewed as a citizen, right? And what happens and how you manage that type of dueling identity in your life, whether you've been here more recently or whether your family has been here for years. This idea of being undocumented, this idea of even looking the part, right? It means you are questioned, you're pulled over by Border Patrol, you are checked at Border Patrol check or DUI checkpoints, right? Because those are also designed to target undocumented communities. And so you again are dealing with this dual identity. Another conflict theorist, his name is Karl Marx. There's been a lot of misuse of Karl Marx's work because he heavily critiques this idea of capitalism. And capitalism is what fuels the United States, regardless of whether or not we want to admit it. Technically, we are a mixed market economy, and we'll talk about what capitalism is. But capitalism, essentially, on a very basic level, is this idea that everything is for profit. We could sell air if it were possible. We would bottle up air and sell it to people if it were possible, because everything we do is about making profit and about maximizing profit. And so Karl Marx looks at how the two-class structure created by capitalism. So capitalism is where, the owners of the means of production, right? So the people who own the companies are in the top 1%, right? And the people who work for the companies are in the 99%. And the people at the top are making all the money, right? Barely paying their workers. And that's the two-class systems, like this bourgeoisie and proletariat, the rich and the poor, right? That we have this two-class system that causes alienation. And so capitalism was designed to separate the haves and the have-nots. Either you own a business or you work for a business, period. That is how our system is structured. If you own the business, you make all the money. You get to decide how much to pay your workers. Before we had a minimum wage law, you could even have them work 20 hours a day, right? Like there was no labor laws, there was no child labor laws, nothing when this idea of capitalism started to flourish in the United States. And so Karl Marx argues that capitalism causes alienation, which is the loss of control over our creative human capacity to produce, separation from the products we make, and isolation from our fellow workers. So essentially, it took the creativity, it took the personable out of production. And so we went from a society, and there's some, you can kind of argue that through farmers markets and street markets, you might get some of this, but we went from a society where, if I'm a handbag maker. That is my identity. That is what I do. I make bags in my home and I go out and I sell them. I sell them for what they're worth. I sell them for how much time it took me to make them. And people would be willing to pay that, right? You have this beautiful hand woven bag, right? Who was made by Shantae, the bag maker, who lives on X, Y, and Z street, right? Like that was very much like a connection to my identity, the type of products I produced, and people were willing to pay what they were worth. What capitalism does, though, is it takes me out of the picture. And no, it doesn't matter if Shantae made the handbag and she's been making handbags in her family for 300 years. It doesn't matter anymore because I can go buy a handbag that was made in a factory and they made it in like 1 minute. And so they sold it for $20. So it doesn't matter if I, take 3 days to make a $200 handbag. Capitalism values, okay, well, we can make 200 of those handbags in a factory and make so much more money. And so people would rather pay $20 for a handbag because it was made in a factory. It no longer matters that Shantae made that handbag. It matters that I have the handbag and I only paid $20 for it, right? Like that is what everyday capitalism looks like. And so I want you to really think about that. Think about, when you see farmers markets and street vendors and things like that, that is allowing this, that's bringing back the connection to our creative capacity to being connected to the products that we produce versus giving them to large companies, large businesses who oftentimes exploit their workers and sell their products, and it doesn't matter who made it. They're made in a factory. Lastly, under our conflict theorist is going to be our feminist theory. So focuses on the role of women in particular society, unequal treatment based on gender categories, and the perpetuation of patriarchal systems of domination. And so we will talk a lot about feminism, one, because Black feminist theory is one of the main theories that I use, not only as a Black woman, but because it was founded on this idea that the feminist movement, when it happened in the 20s, was very much a white woman's movement from its core. What they were fighting for, we want the right to work. In the 20s, Black women were working. Chicana women, Latina women were working as housekeepers, as service industries, right? And so when you have to understand that it's not just about gender in feminist theory, It's about this intersection and what we call intersectionality of race, class, gender, okay? And so we'll talk about that. There's no need to get caught up on like understanding intersectionality yet, but it is a concept that is very central and important to understanding sociology. Is what a white woman experiences is very much going to be different than what a Black woman or a Chicana woman or a Latina woman is going to experience. And so, you know, the feminist movement has really been misinterpreted, one, by a lot of people as like a man-hating, we don't need men movement. Not at all what most women at the time were going for, right? But again, it was very much defined by the needs and the desires of white women at the time in the 20s. And so there's various waves of the feminist movement. There's your first wave, second wave, and third wave. Black feminist theory came out of the third wave feminism, or we call it like the third world women's movement. And so looking at women of color just across the board and how their experiences were very, very different. And I'm gonna make that very real. During slavery, okay, white women were living very different lives than Black women. Very different lives on so many different levels, okay? And so understanding feminist theories through a conflict perspective is also understanding this term of intersectionality. There's also Chicana feminist theory. And so definitely it's not necessarily under the scope of this course, but also like if you're looking for like some outside enrichment, some cultural enrichment, because Black feminist theory always gives me like this personal fulfillment, definitely look into those different branches of feminist theory. And so our last, very, very, very last theory within this chapter and within the Social 101 level is symbolic interactionism. So symbolic interactionism analyzes everyday form of social interactions to develop an understanding of society as a whole. And so it challenges how we view the world and moves us away from the idea that reality is fixed and unchangeable. So basically, we are taught how to act. We are taught how to interact. Like, and I would just ask you this question. Obviously, you won't be able to answer because this is pre-recorded, but like, how do you know how to behave in a classroom? Like, what do you do when you want to say something? Right? And then you wait to get called on. What do you do when you have to go to the bathroom? I don't know if y'all still, what y'all have to do, but we had bathroom passes, and when those ran out, that was it. And don't ask to go to the bathroom at the wrong time. You can get in trouble, right? Don't stand up when the bell rings because the teacher dismisses you, not the bell, right? Like you are very much taught how to behave in a classroom. A symbolic interactionist looks at that. Like, how do we teach power dynamics in a classroom? How do we teach students that the teacher has the power and they do not, right? Little things like raising your hand, waiting to be called on, don't ask the question at the wrong time, make sure you ask before you go to the bathroom, you know, don't challenge the teacher, you can get you can get in trouble. And this was a lot of my issues in high school. Like, I was not a perfect student on any level. I was not a perfect student. But I got in trouble a lot for not following these rules. One, because I didn't understand why they were so important. Like, why can't I go to the bathroom if I have to go? If I have to go to the bathroom, I have to go to the bathroom, right? But that's not what we are taught to do. We are taught that the teacher has this power to tell you when you can and cannot go to the bathroom. And I actually got a referral my sophomore year in high school because I was told no, and I went up and went, period. Because I had to go. Like, what do you want me to do? Like, literally, what do you want me to do? And so that brings us to our last topic, and also going to be your topic for your personal narrative. And I will be more specific about that. So Erving Goffman is one of the largest producers of knowledge within the symbolic interactionist. And he came up with this idea of the dramaturgical approach. And I want you to take that literally, like drama. Think of drama, theater, stage. So he compares everyday life to the setting of a theater and stage and sees us as theatrical performers. So how do you know how to behave in an interview? How do you know how to behave in a classroom? How do you know what to do when you go to a conference, right? All of these things, we mold ourselves and we change our behavior depending on where we are, who we're with. How do you act at a dinner table when it's just you and your family? How do you act when you go out to dinner with your friends? right? These are very particular roles that we play in our society and within ourselves. And so impression management is your topic for your personal narrative that's due this week. And so impression management involves an individual altering his or her presentation of self to provide information and cues to satisfy a particular audience. And so I want you to think about a time in which you had to manage your impression. And so I will give my own example. So when I'm trying to think of like the best one, I think the most simplest is going to be a job interview, right? Like when I had my first job interview, it was really odd. First of all, it was for a clothing store. I knew internally that I had to do something with my hair. And Black women, y'all know, you understand this. There's very specific ways you're supposed to do your hair for job interviews. Braids would likely not be acceptable. They are becoming more acceptable. We have the Crown Act, which prohibits discrimination against natural hairstyles, but that's not in all states, and that's very new. Braids, twists, locks, etc., cornrows have not been viewed as professional. And so Black women in particular, we've been taught to press our hair, make sure it's laid flat, make sure you look presentable, don't wear it too poofy, you know. And so I knew I had to do something with my hair. So I put my hair up in a slick little bun, made it look as pretty as I could. I made sure that I wore the right clothes. So I had some nice dress pants, some nice shoes. Don't show your toes. Don't show your toes. I don't know why, but that was taught to me. It's like closed-toed shoes. Make sure you wear a belt if you're tucking in your shirt. There's these very particular things that you have to do to manage your impression. It's not only about your appearance. So in your personal narrative, I want you to talk about your appearance and your behavior. So what do you do when you walk in, right? You shake their hand, you're pretty, you don't talk how you would talk in a classroom like I'm talking now. You put on, like, we call it like the white girl voice. Call it what you want, but I have one, okay? I know when to turn it off and when to turn it on. I don't use that in my classroom, but as a student, no, not even as a student. When I worked as a staff member in the counseling department and I had to answer phones, I sure didn't answer how I'm talking now. It's like, hi, thank you for calling counseling. How can I help? You know, you get very, you know that there's a certain voice that is viewed as more pleasant. And I know y'all understand what I mean, okay? And so I want you to talk about a time in which you had to manage your impression, both physically, your appearance, and your behavior, right? And that's gonna be your personal narrative topic for this week. And you only get it if you made it this far in the video. All right, so that was it for chapter 1. Hopefully the length of this video is okay and manageable for you. I know it's a lot of content. Pick out what is meaningful to you. I don't expect you to take everything in and remember it all, right? I know that there are certain pieces that stick out to you. And so take from that take what you need from this lecture, okay? And I will see you all next week.